welcome back. And we're moving into our first conversation for today as we discuss Indigenous rights as a part of the International Day of World Indigenous People. And we have with us on set Cristina, who is the spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance of Southern Belize, and Adriano, who is the vice president of the Toledo Alcaldes Association. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, today specifically is obviously a day to recognize the rights and the existence and challenges of Indigenous people across the globe. And I want to ask, from your perspective, obviously, how you would classify the status of Indigenous persons within Belize and how we have progressed since the declaration 10 years ago.
Okay, that's
jumping right in. Yeah.
I know, right? That's a very important question. But maybe just to provide some context in terms of this day and the significance of this day,
yeah,
and the global context.
Yeah.
There's an estimated 370 million Indigenous people around the world. The Maya people are only one among those. And Indigenous peoples are living across 90 different countries. We certainly make up a very small percentage of the total population of the world. I think it's estimated at 5%. At the same time, Indigenous people, like the Maya people of Belize, remain some of the poorest and most disadvantaged communities. And so it's important to understand that as Indigenous people, Maya people, and Indigenous peoples globally, we are certainly the inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of life. We continue to preserve our own unique identity as Indigenous peoples, and we make up something around 5,000 different cultures, which makes this world a very colorful place, if I might say so myself. But despite our cultural differences, Indigenous peoples around the world, so not just in Belize, we share a lot of common problems.
Yes.
A lot of it we've fought collectively to seek recognition for our rights as Indigenous people, for our identity, for our way of life, and certainly for our traditional lands and resources. So the story of the Maya communities here in Belize is the story of a lot of Indigenous people around the world, where our life has always been a struggle.
Now, let's clarify for our audience how a particular group of persons are deemed an Indigenous group. In Belize, for example, Indigenous is used to describe the Mayans and also the Garifuna community. So when you speak about the numbers of persons across the globe, how is a group identified as an Indigenous community?
So historically, Indigenous peoples around the world, in many instances, were displaced, in many instances faced historical injustices, genocide, relocation, slavery, complete loss of and diminished numbers of their populations as a result of more dominant societies moving on to their territories, moving on to their land. So if you understand that historical context, then you will understand and appreciate that a lot of us remain Indigenous populations, whether or not we are on the actual lands of our ancestors. So in the case of Belize, for instance, the Maya people are the Indigenous people of Belize. We were found here. Our ancestry is connected to this particular space. And so Maya people in Belize, and not just in Belize, but in this region, in the Maya region, are Indigenous to this region. There's clear evidence of that from our Maya temples to, the continued existence of our way of life. The Garifuna people are also now considered Indigenous people. And one might argue their origins did not necessarily start in this space. However, one can also argue that they are Indigenous and they are a distinct people. They continue to maintain a distinct way of life, a distinct culture, a distinct language. Those are also characteristics that determine indigeneity. And so it's about belonging to a distinct people, belonging to a distinct way of life, and not necessarily just the space, the geographical space. The Garifuna people have certainly been the victims of a lot of these genocides and a lot of these relocation and slavery. And so while they might not be able to trace back the exact space that their ancestry comes from, their way of life continues to produce this distinct identity.
Yeah. Now, 10 years ago, there was the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And Belize is a signatory of that declaration. Let's talk about what the United Nations, the countries that make up the United Nations and those who signed on to the declaration, decided as the path they wanted to take when it came to the rights of Indigenous people.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. In September 13, 2007 was the day that the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted and voted on. That's 10 years ago. So this year actually marks the 10th anniversary. And it's a really important time to reflect. This is a declaration that is perhaps the most comprehensive international instrument which speaks to the rights of Indigenous people. What it is really is that it embodies this global consensus, right, on what the rights of Indigenous people are, and it establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, the dignity, and the well-being of Indigenous peoples. Yes. And so this is a really important milestone for countries globally, and to sort of rebuild and repair and heal the relationship between nation states and Indigenous communities on whose territory nation states have established themselves. Yeah. You are absolutely right. Belize was voted in favor of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they have international obligations to adhere to the 46 articles that are embodied within this United Nations Declaration. I've brought here a copy. I always try to distribute it as much as possible because I think that it is poorly read and poorly understood among nation states and among agents that are supposed to bring about these protection for these rights that are enshrined within this declaration.
Now, the reason I brought it up, and I think one of the things that we must remember is that when our country signs on to a declaration, it's a commitment. It's saying that we have acknowledged that the need to meet these goals along with the rest of the world is important. Now, typically, there is a reporting mechanism that is built in as well. In other words, it's not just saying, I'm with you, it's saying 5 years, 10 years later, I have come this far. What has the reporting mechanism been like from Belize in terms of this particular declaration?
Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a declaration. So basically you have committed that you are going to improve upon and adopt the 46 articles. Yeah. A lot of these articles speak on many different issues, and in particular where it concerns the Maya people and what we've perhaps most been known for, which is our land rights struggle. Yeah. Article 26 speaks to that, for example. It says Indigenous people have the right to lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. Yeah. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, land tenures of the Indigenous peoples concerned. So if we take just that one article as an example, Belize has basically committed to protect our lands and resource rights as Maya people. It has not just committed that, there is a legal obligation to do so. And so when you ask about the monitoring, Belize is a part of the United Nations General Assembly, and so they have to go and they have to participate and they have to give a report of the status, not just of Indigenous people's rights, but human rights in general. There's a number of international instruments that Belize has signed on to and adopted. How they have performed on the ground, Belize has a long way to go.
Yeah.
We have a long way to go in terms of embracing Indigenous peoples, Maya peoples, in the fabric of our society in Belize. We have a long way to go in terms of ensuring that the minimum standards, the human rights, are become a part of our common perspective on everything that we do, whether that is national development policies, or for example, we have the Horizon 2030 that Belize as a country has been promoting. Mm-hmm. And Horizon 2030 is not different from what you will find in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It is not different from the aspirations that the Maya people have in terms of land tenure security, in terms of the ability for a self-determined people to really define their own development, to really produce a future for their future generations in a way that protects their distinct way of life, in a way that protects their culture, their identity, their language. And so what you will find is that many countries, not just Belize, but many countries around the world have these international obligations. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, Indigenous peoples remain some of the most marginalized and disadvantaged communities, even after we've gotten this global consensus on what our rights are.
Yeah. You know, I want to bring Adriano into the conversation because I think the Alcalde system and the Alcalde Association obviously is a great way to show or to demonstrate to the wider public that the Mayan culture has its own structure in place and one that has survived all these years. Now, Adriana, talk to us a bit about what it is like on the ground, being able to use the cultural system of governing in conjunction with what is already established as a part of our own democracy.
I would just like to talk about the Alcalde system. Mm-hmm. What you're speaking about is that our, like how Cristina said, that our culture, our lands, our rights, and things like those. But if you, for example, if I could show you this, for example.
I did want to know what that was.
This is a baton.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is it's similar to the our village police had, but this is a symbolic of what we are wearing, of what we have on the forest. If you look at the colors that we have here, and that's why we as an alcalde, the leader of the people, so we have it on all the way we go. We covers everything. For example, if, as I said, the color. Yeah. We have everything for the forest, the water, the lands, and even though for our crops as well, because we have corn, the yellow corn, the white corn, the black corn, and stuff like those. You know, so that's what I could speak about our alcaldes systems. No.
Now, what do you find within your own communities as an alcalde? How you are able to continue to exert your authority and your privilege as alcalde in your community in conjunction with having an established village council, for example? How do you work together?
In some villages, for example, as an alcalde association, as I am vice president of the alcalde association, so villages, the alcalde and the village council, somewhere they work together, but most of them, they are not agreed to work with our alcaldes, you know. So like how you had said, because an alcalde is, we just like a local magistrate in the community. Whatsoever is created in the community, so we deal with and stuff like those, you know. So, but like it's like some minor problem, you know, but like some big problem, crimes, and we can't deal with, so we have to hand it over to the higher
Village council.
to the higher authorities, you know. So, and that is the way how we work with the alcalde and the chairman in the community.
One must recognize, if I might weigh in on this question, if we go back historically, as we're remembering how this all started, historically when Columbus came to the Americas, there was estimated to be roughly 54 million indigenous people here in this area, and that would include Maya people. That number dwindled to only a fraction very quickly, right? And this was due to many things: diseases, slavery, all the things that I've talked about, ethnic cleansing, you know, genocide. So historically, indigenous peoples have been made to be marginalized and invisible. Right now, we don't have Columbus anymore, but we do have systems, institutionalized systems that continue to marginalize indigenous people, that continue to make us invisible. And you bring up the village council system. The village council system was established even after the state knew and recognized and upheld Maya customary modes of governance. The alcalde system predates British colony. The alcalde system has existed for our people for generations, and it has allowed us to live harmoniously among each other as people, as communities, but also with our environment. And so it is a governance system that has maintained our way of life. Failure to recognize that then allows for the introduction and almost the imposition of a different system. And so what you will find is that there's always a power struggle, you know, a constant undermining of the traditional system of governance. At the same time, in the Maya communities, we have worked really hard, and the alcaldes are to be commended for allowing our communities to understand and appreciate that we are all a part of the same community, and that the divide and conquer tactic is not something that we are going to allow to continue to operate within these two systems. Our chairman and our village councils, they all come from the same village. Our alcalde, our village police, they all come from the same communities. And in order for us to produce a harmonious community, we have to learn to work with each other, regardless of the institutionalized undermining of our traditional way of life. At the end of the day, what we want to uphold is the greatest interests of the community. And the alcaldes, of course, answer to the community directly. Fundamental to our decision making is the authority lies with the community itself and not with the alcalde. The alcalde is only the ambassador of that decision or of those the members of that community. The village council their jurisdiction is a little bit different, and certainly they are a part of the local government of Belize, and so they certainly adhere to the ministers and the Ministry of Local Government. So we've tried.
And the reason I use that particular scenario, because I think it is one example of showing where in a world where we have far more access into some of the indigenous communities, and there is, of course, an overarching governance system that must be established in any country, but there has already existed one in the Maya culture. Now, the alcalde system is recognized, but it shows that there has to be, or there has been established, perhaps your own protocol as to how you manage between what was your traditional way of governance and the also instituted more modern or the village council system that is being used. And for the time that it has been established, we haven't heard that many upsets over it. So there seems that there has been a differentiation put in place. Am I right in saying that, or it's not quite the case?
You know, the Toledo Alcaldes Association, the Alcaldes, the 78 Alcaldes of the 39 Maya villages of southern Belize, you know, they have always struggled to maintain a recognition and a respect for this traditional form of governance. It has not come easy. And certainly we have seen time and time again an attempt to erode our forms of governance. In fact, there is an individual in Toledo who has established his own Toledo Mayas Alcaldes Association and have declared that he will make alcaldes for life. And you know, those are attempts. And while this might not be direct agents of the state, it is certainly following the same targets and the same patterns of complete disrespect for Maya people and their traditional forms of governance. We have seen where alcaldes have been in times past where at their general assemblies they have been targeted to vote for pro-oil candidates when the oil companies were upon our lands, you know, trying to undermine and trying to influence the leadership of the Maya people. We have now seen, it came to our attention, perhaps this is, we can talk about this at a different time, but just to mention that earlier this year, after the recent appointment of alcaldes in January of this year, this is the first time that we've heard a concern raised from the Attorney General's ministry of the legitimacy of the appointment of alcaldes. You will understand and appreciate that since 1916, alcaldes have been elected by their communities, and the state, whether that be the colonial state or the current state, has always adopted those candidates that have been elected by the communities and appointed them as alcaldes. So there are two things we're talking about. We're talking about a customary appointment and a statutory appointment. On the one hand, the customary appointment continues. The villages determine who their alcaldes are. They go through their ceremonial processes. But the statutory appointment is now being drawn into question. This is the first time we've seen that, where we're being told that only the attorney generals can appoint an alcalde and can determine the jurisdiction of an alcalde, and that since I believe it's 2005 maybe, or actually it's earlier than that, since 1998 I think, they're saying that only 9 alcaldes jurisdiction exists when we have 39 Mayan communities that are recognized, that have been recognized for a number of years now. So that entire question of the legitimacy of the appointment, the statutory appointment, based on you know, these technical I guess defects, is not necessarily a concern with the alcaldes. It is a concern with the ministries that are responsible to ensure that the process is followed. And so, but it does raise questions for our alcaldes, because recently we saw a case where someone brought an alcalde to the Supreme Court. You will understand that these cases that the alcaldes hear as local magistrates are petty crimes, both civil and criminal matters. And a gentleman from the village who was not satisfied basically was running away from the alcaldes, brought this matter to the Supreme Court and used the same argument that the Attorney General's ministry is using, that the alcaldes are illegitimate, they were never properly appointed, and therefore they cannot bring charges and fines against him for crimes that he has committed. Well, it went to the Supreme Court. We received the decision after a year of being in the court. in June of this year, June 1st. And the decision was in favor of the alcaldes because, clearly alcaldes don't just wake up one morning and decide, I'm going to be an alcalde, I'm going to be an imposter of this governance system. No, their communities have established processes and decision making to determine who their alcaldes are and give them that customary authority to uphold customary law, to uphold customary practice. And in addition to that, their statutory appointment gives them the jurisdiction to hear, to act as local magistrates.
I think what this case highlights, and I'm glad that you brought it out, is that while oftentimes things have been functioning as status quo, there can always be one particular instance where the legitimacy of whatever practice that you have been, that has been allowed within a community can be questioned, if not fully endorsed or fully set out in some sort of policy in how we respect the rights, specifically of Indigenous people. Now, I want to move into the Maya land rights issue because I think it is perhaps one of the most well-known cases. Obviously, it's a landmark case, but it does show. I asked you before the break, and we've been speaking about this since earlier this week, about the Maya Land Rights Commission. Now, when the courts rule in favor of the Mayan communities for their communal land rights, there was to be an established mechanism where the Mayan communities, the government would come together and essentially work out the details. And there were challenges in the beginning. We know we had conversations in the past about the level of involvement of the Mayan communities. You were able to address that. And I want to ask you now, where are we now in the establishment or the work of the commission and being able to work out the details of how the ruling can be implemented?
So the ruling was in April of 2015. So it has been 2 years. And since that time, we have attempted to maintain this open dialogue with the established Toledo Maya Land Rights Commission, which was established to basically implement the decision of the Caribbean Court of Justice. We've had 4 meetings to date. We are still trying to establish, we've not heard from the commission. They have asked us to give our interpretation of that order, and we have not been able to hear their version or their interpretation of the order. What we find is that there's continues to be a lack of political will to implement. Perhaps this is the story of Indigenous peoples around the world. After years and years of litigation and struggling to secure recognition and respect for your rights, and then finally a high court, and in fact in our case a chain of affirmations determined that the Maya people have rights to their lands and resources. We continue to see this pattern of just dismissiveness of this historic ruling here in the country of Belize. On the international front, however, the story is different. In fact, the Maya land rights case was highlighted in this year's 10th anniversary report on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It was highlighted as one of the historic and groundbreaking affirmations. And in fact, it is transcending the way that we see Indigenous people around the world. This case has been a landmark, not just for Belize, but for globally. And so what we see then here in Belize is a continued lack of political will to really embrace these affirmations. We talk about the Alcaldes system. A part of the argument that was brought into question was whether or not the Alcaldes or the people that the Maya people have named to represent them in this negotiated implementation were legitimately representing the communities, the Maya communities. Well, one thing you will find is that also in the United Nations Declaration, you will find that in order for you to ensure that a people find their own self-determination, fundamental to that is a recognition and a respect for their own modes of decision making, their own traditional systems of governance, their own deciding their own representatives. So that for us is fundamental. We find though that the commission itself is not either they are not educated on these international instruments and obligations of the state, and clearly do not understand what is encompassed within that affirmation of rights. And so for us, it's important that we continue that dialogue with the state, because they have an obligation, and we will continue to report to the Caribbean Court of Justice on the progress or the lack of progress that we have made. At the same time, however, the Maya communities are not going to wait on the Toledo Maya Land Rights Commission to implement this decision. We are a resilient people. We're a self-determined people. We will continue to steward our lands. We will continue to build upon our own well-being, our own dignity, and we will continue to expand our efforts to advocate for human rights and Indigenous rights, not just in Belize, but in the region and globally.
Yeah. Now, I just for clarity's sake, looking at the commission itself and the work that needs to be done, when was the last time that the commission came together to look at this issue again? And how active have they been over the past, since the establishment of the commission?
I believe our last meeting was in March.
March. And we expect another one in June.
Yeah. And you expect, you were supposed to have one in June.
Exactly.
And that didn't happen.
That didn't happen.
We, at the March meeting, we were asked to fill out a log frame of some sort that would analyze line by line the consent order. Now understand that the consent order that was given from the Caribbean Court of Justice was premised upon earlier cases, the Maya land rights case, which started in 2007, which included Santa Cruz and Conejo, and then that led to the 2010 decision. And so one has to appreciate that you must return to the beginning of this case in order to really understand what is encompassed in the consent order, because the consent order references these cases. Now, we weren't privy to the methodology that was going to be used prior to this meeting, and so we asked for some time to give our response. We were given a week, and we came back to a meeting a week later, and we provided, and we've provided this before, and we provided again, the commission with our understanding and our interpretation of this consent order.
So you were asked to interpret it, essentially.
We were asked to interpret it. Yeah. We were also asked to elaborate on what we saw needed to be done in terms of implementation, right? And one of the first things we need to do is to be on the same page in terms of the interpretation of the decision, because if we have different interpretations, then we're not going to come to the same roadmap. And so that was fundamental for us. Since that time, we made that presentation to the commission. The commission told us that they could not respond to us there and then, and that they needed 3 months to provide us with their feedback. It has been more than 3 months. They said that they wouldn't go beyond middle of June. We have been in communication with them. We've written letters to inquire, when are we going to meet? We want to move this thing forward. We have not heard anything from them, unfortunately. And so that continues. This pattern of a lack of regard. And
well, and I think that's a key point to talk about, and especially as spokesperson for the Maya Leaders Alliance and as representative of the Toledo Alcaldes Association, you are representative of the people within your community, and therefore you must go back to them and have them understand why there has been or hasn't been progress in this specific instance. And while we spoke about the ruling itself and what it stands for, the ruling is only the first step. Really, it's being
Correct.
able to move to the point where the recognition, the actual legal recognition of your land rights are established, and that's what the commission is supposed to work towards. How do you, what do you tell your communities at this point? Are they frustrated? Are they concerned? Or are they satisfied that at least the ruling exists and they know they have their affirmation?
Well, it's not all gray. And I might highlight there's certainly a shift in the way that society perceives Maya land rights. For a long time it was demonized, and a long time we were sort of seen as the troublemakers, for lack of a better word. But I think more and more people are beginning to understand and appreciate what this struggle was about. It's not necessarily about land. It really is about a people's way of life, a people's self-determined future. One of the things that we see is a shift in the way that state authorities are relating to us. For example, on our lands, we see cooperation, at least on the local level, to help curb illegal logging and working with the traditional leaders to do that and respecting the decisions of those communities. We see, for example, a recognition that lands can no longer be sold or leased, or grants can't be given on Mayan lands. At least there are precautions that are being taken. We also see where multinational corporations have taught twice about concessions being granted on Maya people's lands. In the past, this was never a thing to consider. And so I think by and large, our communities are witnessing this shift in a pattern of how we are regarded on the local level. And so that's important.
Yes.
And that's important for our communities to appreciate. While the implementation will take a long time, we know that. I don't think that we were ever disillusioned about that. Around the world, Indigenous people are struggling post-litigation. So we have affirmed rights, now what, right? Our communities have embarked, and perhaps this is a good time to introduce, we have embarked on a process of a visioning process to really determine what our lands are going to look like in 100 years. What is it going to look like in 25 years? What are we doing with the resources and the traditional knowledge that we have, our culture as a people, to continue to advance the well-being of our people? And so we have embarked on a process, an initiative we're calling Building Maya Economies, and really being able to develop models of sustainable development where our people are drivers of enterprises, where our people are understanding how we could sustainably use the resources that we have in a way that gives us opportunities for better health care, in a way that helps us to achieve, just like the nation state of Belize, Sustainable Development Goal number 1, which is the eradication of poverty. And so for us as a people, we are not disheartened by the lack of progress in terms of
you expected that it would be.
We expect it. We're not happy with it. And we will certainly continue to ensure that we advocate for greater political will.
Now let me throw in a larger issue here, because I think, and it is, I think, a challenge for people to be able to understand what it takes to preserve cultures, especially within such a changing world. But not only that, when we talk about the southern districts, when we look at some of the practices perhaps that have been traditional to Mayan communities, many may criticize whether or not you should continue with some of traditional practices, and it can be from farming to nutritional issues, to several other areas that have been identified. Now, I want to ask you, where, and when you talk about moving towards sustainable development, where do you see the marriage between maintaining and preserving culture, but still moving towards development?
Mr. Mas can help me here. Perhaps one of the most important things here is the preservation of a value system.
Okay.
As a Maya people, our philosophy, our intimate connection to our land. We don't see land as a commodity, for example. It's not about making money. It's not about making a profit. It really is about ensuring that the greatest interests of our communities are at heart and that there is equality and well-being for all. So I say that because if you look at the Maya communities, all is not perfect. There are certainly things about our culture that need to change. And we will be the first to tell you that no culture is perfect, but there are things that are non-negotiable. And only the communities themselves can determine what those things are.
Okay.
And so rather than maybe exploring for oil, let's say, you know, the vision of the Maya people is really to look, do a self-reflection and be able to say, what is it that we already know, that we already do? What is it in the area of renewable energy that we could pursue? What is it in the area of agriculture? And looking at our unique foods, looking at our unique patterns of extraction from the forest products. Though that is sort of the dialogue that is happening in that regard. It's not just sustainable, it is also building on a way of life, a preservation of a people, rather than just saying, you know, we're going to engage in enterprises that ensure that we have you know, we influence the GDP. We are not measured by GDP. We already have an existing economy. I was talking to some women the other day. They're helping each other. One woman is picking pepitos. So all the women come together to help her. And then all the women go help the other woman pick her cacao. And then everybody goes to pick coffee at a different family. So there is an economy, an existing economy, and it is encompassed in communal labor and collective effort.
Yeah, we've seen women groups that produce beautiful jippy japa baskets, and we've seen other items coming out as well.
So what you want to embrace is those value systems, that system of reciprocity, that system of collective ownership, collective responsibility. Those are the non-negotiables. And I think that that's where you will have an intersection between a Western style of development and an indigenous model of sustainable economic development.
And what I hear from you is really what is set out within the declaration, which is your right to self-determination as well within your own communities. Now let me bring it back to Adriano for a bit to talk a bit about, you've spoken of these consultations to look at what you call developing a Mayan economy. What are some of the things that you are hearing from the communities at this time as to what their vision is for the Mayans that exist in Belize and the future?
If I could speak a bit of that, is that the Maya people, if I could touch on like how Cristina speak about development of our community, it's not that for stop or to brace down any company that come in our village, is that but they have to come in direct with the community, with the leader to speak about, you know, to what they will do, and then, you know, so make them satisfied. The thing is that we don't like is that when the government goes behind us and start to grant it permission for logging or exploration of oils and stuff like those, and that's what we don't like in our community. So
it's a consultation.
It's a consultation. You know.
This is also enshrined in the United Nations Declaration. I mean, this is our roadmap, right? Here it speaks of the free prior informed consent, which is essentially what Mr. Adriano is talking about, that the Maya people want to be engaged, want to be respected, and want to have a say in how their resources are developed. We have developed the Maya consultation framework, which is a minimum standard of engagement as a tool to be used not just by the state but by any outside agents that wants to come onto our lands. We have developed, for example, the natural resource management framework, which is really to ensure that there is conservation and preservation of our natural environments. We also are engaged in making sure that we are part of the dialogues and consultations surrounding national development policies like the tourism policy, the national forest policy. Because at the end of the day, all these policies will have to now begin to consider and adopt the Maya people's rights to their lands and resources, to adopt the minimum standards for Indigenous people's rights in this country.
So we have to start to wrap up the conversation, and I want to ask you, on a day like today where you're celebrating the rights of Indigenous people, and I recall when the Maya lands rights case was before the courts, you know, people came out and spoke of how it was unfair, and had, your critics obviously had an opportunity to say many things. But here's what I find interesting about Belize. We enjoy our diversity. We enjoy promoting all our different cultures, especially our Mayan culture. We speak about our Mayan ruins. We speak of Mayan sites. We speak about the different types of foods and cultures and things that you can see. So I think there is a general embrace that we do have for diversity. But when it comes to understanding that establishing or respecting these cultures, it means that you do have to be a bit more open-minded. So on today, World Indigenous Day, International Day of Indigenous People. What do you want to say to the wider community about the development that has been taking place, about the level of acknowledgement of your rights, and why it is simply just human rights?
Yes. Well, you know, you are absolutely right. Belize is a very diverse country. A lot of times we romanticize this to the extent that we forget that we are to celebrate our diversity, we are to celebrate our differences, and that we should not be afraid of our differences. Maya people have a distinct identity and a distinct culture and a distinct way of life, and we've never kept that away from anybody else. I think we've embraced our Belizean identity, as has other ethnic groups in this country. And so what I would say is that we continue to appreciate and celebrate Indigenous peoples, distinct peoples. You know, for us as a young nation, we have the opportunity to really model something different and something great, to really model a higher standards of human rights. In fact, I should mention here that Belize is coming up for review with the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2018. And it is our hope, and we extend the invitation here and now for other members of civil society to help us to support our government to meet compliance with these international obligations. Because unless we as a people begin to promote and advocate for these rights, we will not see the improvements of the lives of people with regard to human rights standards. And so on a day like this, as much as the Maya people don't have, say, a Maya Day, we continue to celebrate our diversity and our existence as a people and our respect for each other and for our world.
All right. Anything you'd like to say in closing, Adriano?
No, so I'm just thanks that you invite us here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you both for taking the time to be able to join us this morning to discuss just what has been happening, the progress you've been making, and of course, recognizing the anniversary of the declaration 10 years later, right? Thank you once again. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about the Central Health Region recent report on how we're doing health-wise and some of the challenges we've been seeing. Stay tuned.